I was a social worker, a woman with a tidy desk and folders lined up in perfect rows. My hands smelled of antiseptic and paper, and my life of order and rules. One evening phone call, just a few words, and I closed a folder but opened a door I could never walk back through. Now I'm surrounded by concrete, bars, and the shuffle of strangers' footsteps. I thought I was saving a child. Now I'm learning to live with the question, where does help end and crime begin? If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Dr. Emily Collins, and I was 34 years old when my life revolved entirely around a single building made of glass and steel. The research complex stood on the northern edge of Seattle, half hidden by a slope of evergreens and gray mist. To most people, it looked sterile, lifeless, one more corporate facility among many. But to me, it was a cathedral. The hum of centrifuges, the sterile smell of ethanol, the soft whir of ventilation. It was the rhythm of my existence. I spent more hours under the lab's fluorescent lights than I ever did under the sun. It wasn't a place I worked. It was the only place I lived. I led a small team of researchers at a private biomedical institute that specialized in neurodegenerative disorders, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, diseases that hollowed out lives cell by cell. We were searching for something different, something that could halt that decay before it began. My project, the one I had dedicated the last 7 years to, was focused on a compound we called C47. It was still theoretical, fragile, but it carried a promise I could almost touch. In the best projections, it could restore damaged synaptic pathways. In reality, it was little more than a faint curve on a graph and a series of unstable results. But I believed in it. Belief was the only thing that kept me standing when data refused to cooperate. My mornings started before dawn. I would drive to the lab while the city was still wrapped in darkness, drinking coffee that had gone cold by the time I parked. I liked those hours before the others arrived, when the corridors were silent except for the echo of my shoes on the linoleum. I would switch on the fume hood, calibrate the pipettes, and check the temperature logs. There was a comfort in repetition, a kind of meditation that drowned out the noise of doubt. I told myself that if I followed every step perfectly, the universe would reward me with consistency. But science doesn't barter in promises. Outside the glass walls, life went on without me. Friends got married, moved away, had children. My parents stopped asking when I'd visit for holidays. My apartment was a stopover, not a home. The refrigerator held nothing but takeout containers and expired yogurt. The plants on my balcony had died long ago, their brittle stems still in the pots, as if holding vigil for someone who never returned. Yet none of it felt like loss. The lab filled every hollow space in me. It gave me purpose, identity, control. I wasn't alone there, though solitude was easier. My team consisted of 5 people, all brilliant, all exhausted. They looked to me for direction, for reassurance that the chaos of data points meant something. I played that role well. I smiled when they needed confidence. I praised their small victories. I reminded them, and myself, that failure was part of discovery. But every failed test, every unexpected variable, ate away at me in ways they could never see. I couldn't admit it to them, the fear that maybe the hypothesis was flawed, that the dream I had built my life around was slipping through my fingers, molecule by molecule. The funding reports hung over everything like a shadow. We weren't just scientists anymore. We were tenants under the watchful eye of investors who wanted results that could be sold. Every month, I met with the company's representatives, men in pressed suits who smiled politely while asking how soon we could expect a viable prototype. They didn't care about protein misfolding rates or enzyme kinetics. They wanted a number, a date, a headline. Their pressure was always wrapped in courtesy, but it was pressure all the same. I learned to speak their language: progress metrics, risk assessments, projected returns. It was part of the job now. To keep the lights on, you had to speak in profit. Still, beneath the spreadsheets and reports, there was something pure that kept me moving forward. I remembered the first patient I had ever met as a graduate student, a woman who could no longer recognize her own daughter. She had looked at me with eyes full of terror and confusion, trapped inside her own failing mind. That image followed me into every experiment. I wanted to give people like her more than comfort care and soft lighting. I wanted to give them time, a few more years of memory, a few more chances to say goodbye before the disease erased their faces. On good days, when the data aligned for once, I would stand at my workstation and imagine the future headline: Breakthrough in Neural Regeneration. My name below it, not out of vanity, but out of relief. Proof that all the years of sacrifice had meant something. I told myself that the world didn't reward patience, it rewarded results. But at night, when I stared at the ceiling in the dark, I wondered how far I would go to reach that result. The lab was a world of controlled chaos. Each bench carried fragments of hope, half-finished assays, Petri dishes labeled with shorthand that only I could decipher. The air smelled faintly of ethanol and burnt coffee. Music sometimes played softly from a portable speaker, but mostly there was silence, broken only by the clicks of pipette triggers and the occasional curse when an experiment failed. Days bled into nights seamlessly. There were no weekends. There was no boundary between personal and professional. My life had dissolved into data sets, grant applications, and the steady hum of machines that never slept. When the day's work ended, I would sit alone in the observation room, staring at the blue glow of the monitors. I would trace the graphs with my finger, as though touching them could will them into alignment. In those moments, I believed I was close, so close that one more test, one more adjustment, could change everything. It was the illusion every scientist knows too well, that certainty lies just beyond the next trial. The others sometimes joked that I belonged more to the lab than to the world. They were right. I had given it my time, my youth, my health, even my capacity to rest. It was a devotion that bordered on worship, and like all forms of worship, it demanded sacrifice. I thought the sacrifice would be worth it. I thought I could control the cost. The night janitor once told me he could always tell when I was there, even if he hadn't seen me. He said the light in my office stayed on long after everyone else had gone home. He said it made the building look alive, like someone was keeping watch. I wanted to tell him he was right. I was keeping watch, not over the lab, but over the fragile dream that I could save the world from something incurable. I didn't know then that dreams can rot from the inside if you don't give them air. That devotion, when starved of rest and truth, curdles into obsession. I told myself that dedication was the same as integrity. I told myself that every hour spent there was proof of my worth. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet, no. At the time, all I knew was the comforting hum of machines, the endless data sheets waiting for meaning, and the quiet conviction that I was close, so close, to changing everything. The lab was my home, my confessional, my entire world, and I couldn't imagine that world ever collapsing. The email arrived late on a Sunday night, glowing on my phone screen like a warning flare. I was sitting at my kitchen table, half asleep over the last cup of coffee, when I saw the subject line, Urgent, Funding Status Update. The words carried a kind of weight that didn't need explanation. My heart started its slow, heavy rhythm before I even opened it. The message was short, direct, and devastating in its calmness. The board was reviewing our project. Progress had been deemed insufficient. Additional results were required by the end of the quarter to justify continued funding. If the next report did not show quantifiable improvement, the program would be suspended indefinitely. It was written in the polite, almost corporate tone of someone telling you you're running out of air while smiling. 6 weeks. That was all they were giving us. I sat there in the silence of my apartment, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound, staring at the blue light of the email. Outside, the city was muted, rain streaking down the window in faint diagonal lines. The words began to echo in my head. Quantifiable improvement. The phrase sounded clinical, detached, but I knew what it meant. It meant survival. It meant the years I had poured into this project would be erased if the data didn't perform. The next morning, I arrived at the lab before dawn. The air smelled of disinfectant and electricity, a mix that had long since replaced the scent of sleep in my life. I turned on the main lights, the fluorescent stabbing through the dim corridors, and sat at my desk, surrounded by stacks of notes and charts. The data didn't lie, but it also didn't move fast enough. Every trial was a battle between theory and biology, between time and patience, and time had always been the enemy. By 9 o'clock, the team was there, their faces pale from the glare of screens and anxiety. They already knew. News in a lab traveled faster than light. I stood in front of them, explaining the new timeline, hearing my own voice flatten into something managerial, emotionless. 6 weeks. Every result mattered now. Every mistake would count twice. I tried to sound calm, but inside me something had begun to tremble, a fragile line between determination and desperation. We worked as if possessed. Hours lost their shape. The outside world dissolved into a loop of data entries, culture samples, and the constant rhythmic hum of machines that never rested. Meals were replaced with vending machine snacks. Sleep came in 2-hour intervals, sometimes at the desk, sometimes not at all. The lab became an organism of its own, feeding on exhaustion and caffeine. I watched my team move through it like ghosts. They trusted me to lead them through the fire, and I told myself I could. Each morning, I opened the latest batch of results and felt the same sinking dread. The numbers were close, but not enough. The efficacy rate plateaued just below the threshold required for approval, a gap of 3%. 3% between continuation and collapse. I tried to find patterns where there were none, ran simulations, adjusted variables, hoping for a miracle that science never offered. The investors began calling directly. Their voices were polished and patient, but beneath the courtesy was panic. They wanted reassurance. They wanted certainty. They wanted me to tell them that everything was fine, and I did. I told them what they needed to hear, crafting sentences like scaffolding around a crumbling building. Each conversation left a film of shame on my tongue. I was supposed to be the scientist, the truth teller, the one who stood on evidence and nothing else. But the truth at that moment felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. At night, I stared at the graphs projected on the lab wall. Blue lines, red lines, steady declines, false rises. I tried to imagine what success would look like, what it would feel like to see those numbers cross the threshold, to breathe again. But the more I stared, the further it drifted from reach. Hope and panic became indistinguishable. I could no longer tell if I was chasing discovery or just running from failure. I began to notice small things breaking down. The younger researchers were making mistakes they never would have made before. Incorrect pipetting, mislabeled samples, forgotten controls. They were too tired to focus. I wanted to comfort them, but I had nothing left to give. Instead, I grew sharper, colder. I barked orders. I triple-checked their work and stayed long after they went home. I told myself I was protecting the project, but in truth, I was protecting myself. The thought of losing everything was unbearable. The stress turned physical. I woke with headaches that felt like drills behind my eyes. My hands trembled when I held the pipette. I went days without proper meals, then binged on black coffee and sugar just to stay upright. My reflection in the glass door of the lab frightened me. Pale skin, eyes hollowed by fluorescent light, a thin smile stretched too tight. I was becoming something mechanical, driven not by curiosity anymore, but by compulsion. As the deadline crept closer, I found myself counting not in days, but in data points. Each new assay, each fraction of improvement became a lifeline, but the numbers remained stubborn. I started to think of them as living things that refused to obey. They were mocking me, defying my will. I wanted to force them to behave, to fall into line, to confirm what I already believed, that the treatment worked, that my years of sacrifice meant something. On the 23rd night, I stayed alone after everyone left. The rain outside drummed against the windows, a relentless sound that mirrored the pulse in my head. I sat before the monitor, staring at the dataset that had consumed me. The cursor blinked in the spreadsheet, waiting. I zoomed in on one column, the efficacy rate, 67.4%. I knew what it needed to be, 70%. 3 little points, 3 insignificant units on a scale that would decide the fate of the research, the lab, my career. I told myself it wasn't deception. It was correction, compensation for human error. An adjustment, not a lie. I told myself that once the next phase confirmed the results, it wouldn't matter. I told myself that I was saving not just the project, but the people depending on it, the patients, the team, the investors, everyone. I repeated those thoughts like prayers. The mouse hovered over the number. I hesitated. My throat felt dry. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint flicker of the monitors, the beating of my heart, everything seemed amplified. I knew that this was the line, that nothing after it would ever be the same. And then, with one small motion, I pressed the key. The number changed. 67.4 became 70.1. The screen refreshed. The data now looked perfect. I sat there, breathing shallowly, waiting for some physical sign that the world had shifted. But it didn't. The monitors hummed. The rain fell. Everything remained exactly as it had been, except for one cell and one file that would change the course of everything that came after. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen until my eyes blurred. For a moment, I felt relief, the kind that comes after holding your breath too long. But beneath it, like sediment in water, there was something darker. Guilt didn't announce itself loudly. It crept in quietly, patient and certain. I told myself I would fix it later, that I would rerun the tests and make the data real, that I would earn the number I had just created. But deep down, I knew Science doesn't wait for redemption. Once a number becomes truth on paper, it stops belonging to you. It becomes fact. It becomes the story the world believes. And that night, I had written the first line of a story that would destroy me. The first headline appeared 2 months later. Breakthrough in neurodegenerative research. Dr. Emily Collins's team achieves unprecedented results. My name was printed in bold type, black against the white of the morning paper that someone had left on the counter near the espresso machine. The letters seemed to vibrate as I read them, like a frequency my body couldn't quite absorb. I stood there in my lab coat, fingers sticky from coffee, heart steady but hollow. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, but never like this. Not with that quiet nausea in my throat. Not with the faint chemical smell of guilt floating just beneath the surface. The emails followed. Congratulations, invitations, mentions in journals I had only dreamed of. The lab that had once been a forgotten corner of the research wing suddenly became the centerpiece of the company's next investor presentation. Cameras arrived. So did the suits. They wanted to see the lab, to meet the brilliant mind behind the discovery. I smiled for the photographs, straightened my posture, and answered their questions in precise, confident phrases. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't crack. I was composed, articulate, radiant even. They called me a visionary. I felt like a thief. Everywhere I turned, success glimmered like a reflection on glass, beautiful but impossible to touch. The company released press statements about our historic advancement in regenerative medicine. The university reached out about potential partnerships. Even the city's mayor's office sent a formal note of recognition. I printed none of it. I saved it all in a folder on my desktop that I rarely opened, a digital shrine to everything I couldn't bear to celebrate. The team was ecstatic. They moved through the lab with renewed purpose, their exhaustion replaced by pride. They believed we had done something extraordinary, and I let them. I told myself it was for their sake, that they deserved the hope after years of failures. But every time they looked at me with gratitude, a part of me wanted to turn away. They didn't know that the victory they were breathing in was laced with something rotten. The data that had once kept me awake at night now lived in binders, perfectly organized and verified. Each graph was a monument to a number I had nudged, a line I had crossed. The results were too clean, too perfect, but no one noticed. In science, success is so rare that when it appears, people don't question it. They celebrate it. The company didn't want to find flaws. Investors didn't want to ask. Everyone wanted a story to believe in, and I had given them one. It started small at first, a few public talks, a recorded panel discussion, a feature in a scientific magazine. I told the same rehearsed story each time, how we had pushed through failure, how perseverance had paid off, how science rewards those who refuse to give up. They called me inspiring. The applause sounded like applause should, loud, affirming, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was meant for someone else, someone honest, someone clean. I began to live two lives. In one, I was the rising star of neuroscience, the woman who had delivered hope to millions. In the other, I was the keeper of a secret that pulsed like a second heartbeat under my ribs. I learned to manage both. During the day, I stood in conference rooms under warm lights, talking about breakthroughs. At night, I sat alone in the lab, staring at the old spreadsheets, tracing the edits I had made. My lie was so small, so mathematically insignificant, yet it had grown into a monolith that towered over me. Sometimes, when the building emptied and the machines powered down, I thought about undoing it, about going back, correcting the files, telling the truth. But truth in science wasn't just data, it was timing. Once something entered the public record, it became part of the collective faith of the field. To withdraw it now would be to confess, not to correct. I had built a monument, and the only way to take it down was to bury myself under it. The first time I heard my own name spoken on television, I was in the break room. One of the younger technicians turned up the volume, grinning. The segment showed footage of our lab, sterile and bright, intercut with a voiceover describing our groundbreaking research. My image flashed briefly on the screen, smiling, eyes lit with a confidence that no longer existed. The technician clapped me on the shoulder, thrilled. I forced a smile, but inside I was sinking. The sound of my name spoken by a stranger felt like an accusation. Recognition spread faster than I could contain it. Invitations arrived from universities, pharmaceutical boards, advocacy foundations. I traveled to conferences where audiences hung on every word I said. The applause was thunderous, the lights were blinding, and still, every time I stood behind a podium, I thought about that cell in that spreadsheet, the one that had turned 67.4 into 70.1, three numbers that had rewritten my life. I tried to silence the voice inside me with work. I pushed the project forward, expanded the trials, assigned new tasks to the team. But no matter how much we produced, the guilt stayed. It was no longer a sharp pain, but a dull ache, constant, steady, familiar. I thought I could bury it under progress, but progress only amplified it. With every new milestone, I felt the ground under me thinning. The smell of the lab began to change for me. It had once smelled like alcohol and promise, a mixture of chemicals and hope. Now it smelled of decay. Every surface gleamed too cleanly. Every file, every report felt like a layer of paint over a crack in the wall. I found myself scrubbing benches long after everyone had gone home, as if the act could cleanse something deeper. Sleep became a negotiation. When I did sleep, I dreamed of numbers, rows and rows of numbers that twisted into faces, each one looking at me silently. I would wake in a sweat, heart racing, the sheets tangled around me. In the mornings, I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a stranger with tired eyes and a practiced smile. The company began to use my image in their promotional materials. My face appeared in brochures, on their website, alongside phrases like innovation and integrity. That word, integrity, seemed to mock me every time I saw it. I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that I didn't deserve to represent it. But I didn't. I smiled. I signed the paperwork. I cashed the checks. The success became a cage. Every new achievement tightened the bars. The higher I climbed, the less freedom I had to confess. The machine was moving now, too big, too powerful, and my lie was its fuel. If I pulled it out, everything would collapse. Not just me, but the team, the company, the research itself. People's jobs, reputations, futures, they all rested on a false foundation I had built in one exhausted night. I told myself I had done it for the science, that it was temporary, that the end would justify the means. But the truth was simpler and far uglier. I had done it because I couldn't bear to fail, because I had spent too many years building an identity that couldn't survive disappointment. One evening, after another round of interviews, I returned to the lab. The building was quiet. The lights dimmed automatically at midnight, casting everything in a pale glow. I walked between the benches, the equipment gleaming like metal bones. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. I stood before the monitor where it had all begun, and for the first time, I realized how irreversible it all was. The screens displayed progress, projections, a future that didn't exist. It looked beautiful, perfect, and yet all I could feel was the weight of the lie that made it possible. Success had a smell, and I could recognize it now, sharp, sterile, with a trace of rot beneath the surface. It was the smell of something dying under the shine of its own illusion. It began quietly, as all disasters do, not with an explosion, but with a whisper. A single email from an external reviewer, polite and efficient, requesting access to our raw data for verification. It was routine, or at least it should have been. I had received dozens of such requests in the past, but when I opened that message, my pulse skipped. The reviewer's tone was calm, but his questions were surgical. He wasn't asking for summaries or final reports. He wanted the raw files, the original timestamps, the unfiltered numbers that no one outside the lab had ever seen. I stared at the screen for a long time before responding. My fingers hovered above the keyboard, motionless. It was only a matter of time, I thought. The inevitable has a way of creeping up on you, slowly at first, then all at once. I sent a vague reply about ongoing data consolidation, buying myself days, maybe a week. But time was a shrinking thing now, pressing against me from all sides. The request had come from the Food and Drug Administration's Secondary Review Board. They were launching an independent analysis before approving the next phase of our trials. I knew what that meant. They would pull apart every variable, every sample, every decimal, and when they did, they would find it. The three numbers I had changed. My entire empire, built on precision and presentation, was about to be reduced to a single cell in a spreadsheet. The next few days blurred together. Meetings, reports, the usual performance of control. I wore my calm like a costume. The team continued their work unaware of the gathering storm. They were proud, excited, full of belief. I envied their ignorance. Every time I looked at them, a sharp pain twisted inside me. They had trusted me to lead them through the chaos of science. I had led them into a lie. By Friday, the request became a demand. The company's compliance officer called me directly, her voice crisp and professional. The reviewers wanted access by the end of the day. No exceptions. I could hear the faint tapping of her keyboard in the background as she spoke, her tone indifferent, mechanical. To her, it was just procedure. To me, it was the sound of the floor giving way. I opened the folders on my computer one by one. Rows of files filled the screen. Years of work, thousands of trials, endless numbers. It was all there, buried among truth and error alike. A single corrupted line waiting to be unearthed. I imagined the reviewer scrolling through it, line by line, until he saw the change, until the illusion shattered. I imagined the stillness that would follow, the pause before the questions began. For a moment, I considered deleting everything, wiping the data, claiming a technical malfunction, a server failure. It would be believable. Our system had glitched before. But I couldn't do it. There are lies you tell the world, and there are lies you can't tell yourself. I had already crossed one line. I didn't have the strength to cross another. So I sent the files. That night, I didn't sleep. The rain fell hard against the windows, drumming like an accusation. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for the morning to arrive, and with it, the consequences. The next day passed in silence, then another, and then on the third day, the phone rang. It was the compliance office again. Their tone had changed, no longer neutral, no longer polite. They had concerns about inconsistencies in the data. They wanted me to come in for a meeting. I already knew what they had found. The conference room was cold, deliberately so. I sat across from two men I had never met before, both wearing suits that seemed to have been pressed by their own authority. One of them spoke while the other watched. They showed me printouts of my own numbers, pointing at the discrepancies, at the mismatched timestamps, at the gaps where the original data should have been. They used phrases like data manipulation and ethical breach. Their words were technical, but their eyes were human, sharp, hungry, judgmental. I listened without interruption, without defense. What was there to say? Every sentence they spoke was a mirror held up to me. When they finished, I tried to speak, but my throat tightened. I wanted to explain, to tell them that it hadn't been greed or ego or ambition, that it had been fear, fear of failure, fear of seeing everything I'd built disappear into a void of almosts. But explanations sound like excuses when the evidence is written in your own hand. The room emptied slowly. I was told that the company would conduct an internal investigation, that the board would meet to determine next steps. I was suspended until further notice. They handed me an envelope with instructions and escorted me to the exit like a stranger. As I walked through the glass doors, the receptionist avoided my eyes. I realized then how quickly admiration can turn into discomfort, how easily people retreat from someone who has fallen out of favor. Outside, the city felt foreign. The air was heavy with mist, the sound of traffic distant and distorted. I walked without direction, through streets I had driven down for years but had never really seen. My reflection in the shop windows looked unfamiliar. A woman in a dark coat, her shoulders slightly hunched, her face pale with exhaustion. I looked like someone who had outlived her own purpose. The news reached the press within a week. An anonymous source had leaked the story to one of the major science journals. Data irregularities found in promising neuroregeneration study. The headline didn't use my name, but it didn't have to. Everyone in my field knew. My inbox filled with messages, some sympathetic, most cautious, all distant. The institution issued a statement about their commitment to scientific integrity. My name was nowhere in it. Colleagues who had once invited me to conferences stopped responding. Students who had called me their mentor deleted me from their acknowledgments. My team was reassigned to other projects. I watched from the sidelines as my life's work was dismantled piece by piece, sterilized of my existence. Then came the formal accusation: fraud, misrepresentation of data, intent to deceive, legal phrases that stripped my actions of every ounce of humanity. There was no mention of the late nights, the collapsing deadlines, the years of devotion. There was no mention of the intent to save a dream. Only the crime remained. The hearings were clinical and public. My name was spoken like a warning, my reputation dissected like a specimen. I sat through every minute of it, motionless, listening as others interpreted my choices. The media painted me as both villain and tragedy. Some called me ambitious beyond reason. Others called me desperate. Both were true. When it was over, when the verdict came, it wasn't relief I felt, but emptiness. The truth had finally come to light, but it didn't cleanse anything. It didn't feel like justice. It felt like the slow unraveling of everything that had once given me shape. The truth had no warmth. It was a cold, surgical thing that cut through the fabric of illusion and left nothing in its place. In the end, I didn't fight it. There was nothing left to defend. The lie had been mine, but the consequences belong to everyone. My colleagues lost their funding. The patients lost their hope. The investors lost their faith. And I, who had wanted to save time, had run out of it completely. The truth had surfaced, quiet and unmerciful, stripping me of everything except the one thing I had tried hardest to avoid: myself. After the hearings ended, there was no prison sentence, but the world I had once occupied sealed its doors behind me with quiet finality. The journals rescinded my published studies. My name was removed from the conference rosters. Grants I hadn't even applied for began sending me formal denials as if preemptively ensuring I wouldn't try. My university revoked tenure. The lab was shut down. My badge no longer opened the building that had once felt more like home than my apartment ever had. I moved out of the city within a month. The apartment I chose was small, anonymous, tucked above a laundromat in a town with no research hospitals. I bought used furniture off classified ads and filled the silence with audiobooks I barely listened to. Every morning I walked to a local cafe where no one knew my name and drank coffee slowly, just to delay returning to the echo of my own disgrace. The formula itself, the work that had once pulsed like a living thing in my hands, was frozen in limbo. No further trials, no application, no review. My lawyer advised me not to speak publicly, not to claim ownership, not to appear remorseful or righteous, just silent. My work was no longer mine. It belonged to a legal archive, a cautionary tale. I kept thinking of the patients it might have helped. I had made those charts myself. I had read every case study, had imagined the people behind the numbers: the child with degenerative nerve damage, the war veteran unable to hold a cup, the woman who hadn't spoken in 5 years. I hadn't been chasing fame. I had been chasing them, their small hopes, their last chances. That was the cruelest irony. I had falsified data not for glory, but to keep the clock from running out. And in the end, I had guaranteed the very outcome I'd feared. Nothing. No trial. No drug. Just silence. Some nights, I lay awake calculating timelines. If I had just waited 2 more weeks, perhaps the real results would have caught up. If I had delayed the report, maybe I could have presented real data. If I had trusted the science instead of the system, would I have saved both the project and myself? But regret, like science, deals in hypothesis. It can measure what was, but never fully predict what could have been. A few months later, I received a letter. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a copy of a lab result, one I hadn't forged. It showed improvement, real improvement. It must have come from one of the early participants, someone who had managed to continue the protocol privately, quietly. There was no signature, just a short line scribbled beneath the graph. It worked, even if they never know it. I stared at it for a long time. It didn't change anything, not legally. It didn't undo the trial collapse, the lost funding, the obliterated credibility. But it made something shift inside me, a tremor of meaning in the rubble. The formula, even flawed, had touched something real, and someone, somewhere, had healed, even if the world never credited me, even if my name would forever be an asterisk. For the first time in months, I pulled out my old notebooks. They were heavy with margin notes and frustration, sketches of molecules, ink-blotted corrections. I turned each page like touching old skin. My hands trembled, but not from shame. I began to write again, not research papers, just thoughts, memory, context. I wrote the full story of what happened, not for absolution, but for understanding. I wanted to remember the human urgency behind the numbers, the sacred pressure of trying to fix the unfixable. Maybe someday another scientist would find those notes and see not just the failure, but the fight. Maybe they'd pick up the thread. The price I paid wasn't just my career. It was the fracture of identity, the knowledge that I had compromised something I believed sacred. But in that fracture, I found something else, the unshakable truth that some discoveries live on, even if their creators do not. Science doesn't forgive, but sometimes it remembers. And maybe that was enough. Redemption wasn't a courtroom victory. It wasn't a second chance at the university or a funding grant miraculously reinstated. It wasn't even the approval of peers whose eyes now slid past me in professional spaces like I was a stain they couldn't scrub off the collective memory of science. No, redemption was quieter, messier, lonelier than that. It crept in through cracks in the walls I'd built around myself, disguised as purpose, disguised as something to do with my hands when sleep wouldn't come. I had thought for a time that my life was over, not in the way of mortality, but in the way an identity fractures beyond repair. The headlines had been brutal: data deceiver, the false healer, the $1 million lie. It didn't matter that I hadn't made a cent from the deception. The public didn't care about nuance. They wanted a villain, and I had fit the shape of one far too neatly. But somewhere between disgrace and disappearance, something small began to shift. It started the day I walked into a local high school to volunteer in their underfunded science program. I hadn't planned to reveal my background. I thought I'd help set up equipment, maybe tutor a few struggling students in biology. I was fully prepared to hide my name, my history, the trail of ash behind my last publication. But life, I've learned, has a way of exposing what you think you've buried. One of the students found an old article about me, the one with my mugshot beside a headline about scientific fraud. She printed it, bold and trembling, and placed it on my desk after school. Her eyes were wide, uncertain, afraid of what it meant. I sat there for a moment looking at her, looking at the paper, looking at the truth I could no longer run from. And then I told her everything. I didn't dress it up. I didn't excuse it. I told her I had made a mistake, one born of pressure and fear, of time running out, of 1,000 calculations that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with desperation. I told her I had been wrong, that being right too early, or too hungry, or too afraid wasn't the same as being righteous. She didn't speak, just nodded, then quietly said, "But the drug worked, didn't it?" I had no answer for that, only questions that still kept me awake. Weeks passed. I expected the school to ask me not to return. I waited for angry parents, for another round of public shaming. None came. Instead, the science teacher, an older woman with silver curls and eyes like microscope lenses, thanked me for staying. She told me the students had never listened so closely, never asked so many questions. They were interested not just in the equations and outcomes, but in the ethics, the risks, the responsibilities, the humanity inside the science. That's when I realized that maybe this was the only redemption I would ever get, the chance to teach others not how to avoid failure, but how to understand it when it arrives, how to live inside it without letting it hollow you out. How to carry it forward like a wound you learn to walk with, instead of letting it become a weight that keeps you from standing. I began speaking more openly, not in grand conferences or televised interviews, but in classrooms, in community centers, in church basements, where the curious gathered in plastic chairs and brought with them notebooks and questions and kindness. I talked about pressure, about systems that reward speed over precision, about the razor-thin line between scientific courage and scientific arrogance. I shared everything, not to cleanse myself, but to offer the warning I never got. Eventually, I started writing again, carefully, quietly. I didn't submit papers to journals. I started a blog under a pseudonym. I wrote about failure as a biological constant, about resilience as a chemical reaction. I wrote about the patients who had filled my mind more than the headlines ever could. Their faces, their stories, their ghostly hope that had haunted my sleepless nights. Sometimes I received emails from young scientists who had stumbled on my writing. They were anonymous, or almost. Some asked how to handle pressure from supervisors. Others admitted to fudging numbers and begged to know what to do before it spiraled. I never told them to confess immediately. I told them to pause, to breathe, to return to the core of why they started this work in the first place, and to let that truth guide them. My name remained tainted in the official record, but in these small, invisible spaces, I felt something like healing, not absolution, but motion, forward even if slow, even if unrecognized. One day, years after everything had fallen apart, I received a letter forwarded through my old university's legal office. It was from the mother of a boy who had once participated in my trial. She wrote to say that though the drug was never approved, they had managed to synthesize a similar compound abroad, and that it had helped her son regain partial movement in his right hand. He could write again, she said. He could feed himself. He could hug. She ended the letter with a sentence I will never forget. I don't care how you got there. I just thank you for trying. That sentence, those 8 words, became the closest thing to forgiveness I would ever hold. Redemption, I learned, was not a formula. It was a series of choices made after the fall. It was what you did with the ruins. It was the willingness to keep building, even with nothing but broken pieces. I was not a pioneer anymore, not a doctor, not a scientist the world celebrated, but I was something else, a reminder, a witness, a voice still speaking, even from the margin. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.